Gerton Williams, my childhood. My name is Marion Elizabeth Gerton Williams, and these are reminiscences of the early years of my life. During the heart of the Depression, my parents, Marjorie Leota Spinney and Kenneth Thompson Gerton, had moved with my paternal grandparents to a farm with an apple orchard. The farm was located on Christian Hill in Barre, Massachusetts. It was at this farmhouse in the middle of a blizzard that I arrived on February 7, 1933. Dr. Bates, the longtime family physician, came by snowplow. My breech birth was very difficult and hazardous for my mother. I was born premature and weighed a little over 4 pounds. With no incubator available, I was placed in a basket near the kitchen stove for warmth. There was some doubt as to whether or not I would live. Surprisingly, I did survive. It seemed as though I was born hungry. In those years, babies were usually given only milk, but my mother often mashed bananas to help fill me. My first word I spoke was more. In spite of an enormous appetite, I was very tiny and fragile until the age of 2. A neighbor had suggested that I needed to get some dirt into my system. My mother said I finally started to grow after I played outside in a sandbox. During most of my early years, my mother, father, and I lived on the first floor of a 2-story house on Kendall Street. We rented our house from Elgin and Viola Belcher, the florists who had their business on property next to our house. I loved looking at all the beautiful flowers in their greenhouse and walking down the rows of carnations, sniffing their cinnamon fragrance. The house was very cold and drafty. Each fall, my father bagged the outside of the house by placing boxes filled with dirt around the exterior of the house to keep the wind from coming under the floors. In the winter, I moved from my bedroom and slept in the living room for warmth. Our house was right across the street from the home of my maternal grandparents, Nanny and Daggy Spinney. Their home was always open to me. I went there after school when my mother was working, and I often stayed there when my parents went out for the evening. Sometimes I would share a bed with Aunt Ella, who complained about the noise when I grated my teeth. One night, when Ella had just come home from the hospital after surgery for appendicitis, she put a row of pillows between us so I would not kick her abdomen. Louis, my mother's younger brother, was only 2.5 years older than I, and we always played together. Louis and I spent hours playing cars on the landing of the stairway. The cars were little metal or hard rubber ones, usually bought at Simmonson's store. We had little buildings for homes and businesses, and matchstick roads extended all through the hall. My great-grandmother, Orinda Spinney, lived with my grandparents. Grandma Spinney, who was in her 80s, was a very sweet lady. Sometimes she would stay with me when my parents went out for the evening. Louis and I liked to tease her by jumping out of closets at her. Years later, I wished we had not been so childish. Along with Louis and my cousin Vern Dixon, who was 1 week older than I, my closest childhood friends were Andrea and Lucille Belcher and Sally Lang. Other friends and classmates were Jeannie Parker, Eleanor Newcomb, Irene Cody, Beverly Rice, Kay Howard, Christine Brown, and Marion Glidden. We also played with David Williams, who spent winters in West Palm Beach, Florida. My first recollection of life occurred during the devastating hurricane and flood in September of 1938. I recall watching huge trees being uprooted and crashing to the ground by the fierce winds of the hurricane. I watched this dramatic scene from the glassed-in sun porch of my grandparents' living quarters over the drugstore which faced the common in Barre. The night before, floodwater had reached the top step of the basement stairs at the house of Nanny and Daggy Spinney. It was after midnight that my mother and father left to get my grandfather, who was standing watch at the Allen Company. They rescued him just as the dam for the pond adjacent to the factory broke. washing out bridges and flooding the whole lower part of town. So I have a little thing here that I cut out of the Today in History. And here it says, in 1938, September 21st, a hurricane struck parts of New York and New England, causing widespread damage and claiming some 700 lives.
Wow.
And I've written in detail about the flood and the hurricane. And in those days, there was very little advanced notice, and we didn't have the weather predictions that we did now. And New England had really never had a hurricane. They had no idea what was happening. And then when the eye came, they thought it was over, and they all came out, and it was a very, very bad time.
Now, hurricane, that's no water concern, that is.
Oh, yeah, that, the flood that had come,
Okay, that.
actually the day before,
Yeah.
and
I was
that's
thinking
what brought all the
they're kind
water.
of dry.
Yeah, when my parents went to rescue my grandfather, they had to come back by boat across from where the bridges had all gone out all the way along, and so somebody got them across on a boat or a raft, and then they walked back. My town is on like a plateau at 1,500 feet, and all the roads going out of town go down hills. And so they were like, a mile down in the valley. And so once they got back across on their side, then they had to walk up, and my mom was in her pajamas.
We were involved in an earthquake when we first came out here from New Mexico over in eastern Washington. That was scary too. We've never been in one before.
Well, and the tornadoes are terrible, what they have done. So.